In this presentation, we are going to focus on one of the North American rivers that played a substantial role in the founding of the United States and continues to influence water and environmental policy today. That great river is the Hudson River in eastern North America. The Hudson River watershed lies largely in eastern New York State, which lies on the east coast of North America. The larger watershed also drains portions of Massachusetts and Vermont. As this river is primarily confined to one state, the Hudson River is closely tied to the history of New York. This means that actions in the New York human environment strongly influence the river, while the river also influences the human environment. It is a great example of a local synergistic system. The main channel of the Hudson River starts in Lake Tier of the Clouds, which lies within the Adirondack Mountains. From here, the river flows south until it drains into the Atlantic Ocean by New York City. Well, it sort of drains here. We will chat about how the actual drainage point of the Hudson is not as clear as it is with many other rivers. While the main channel of the Hudson River runs from Tier of the Clouds Lake, the Mohawk River is a major sub-watershed that drains into the lower basin. The Mohawk River starts as a valley drainage in the western Adirondacks before making its way eastward where it joins with the Hudson River near Troy, New York. To provide some quick statistics about the larger watershed, the Hudson is 325 miles long, while the Mohawk River is 149 miles long. The watershed drains an area of 13,400 square miles, and 25% of New York State lies within the watershed. The river has a rich Native American history and has several names from the different tribes. The geology of the upper part of the Hudson River watershed was shaped by plate tectonics and glaciation. The Adirondack Mountains began to be formed around 2 billion years ago when two tectonic plates collided, resulting in the region being lifted as one plate pushed under the other. Then these plates began to pull apart, creating sinking spots that formed deep lakes such as Lake George. This was followed by the region being frozen in the Ice Age, where the glaciers smoothed and shaped the lands before eventually melting with the drainage water carving valleys and river channels. This is the characteristic geology of the upper watershed. And then there is the lower Hudson River, where things begin to get strange. But first, we need to define a term when we start looking at the lower Hudson River watershed. When we look at the Hudson River, we need to understand an ecological feature called an estuary. An estuary is where a river meets an ocean. These estuaries are influenced by both the ocean and the river, creating really interesting environments that are not only important in terms of biological diversity, but can also influence the system in terms of water flows and flooding. With the current river channel, the estuary goes from the ocean up into the river for 153 miles to the city of Troy. So for this watershed, the ocean influences almost half of the length of the river. I grew up in the lower part of the Hudson River Basin, and I had no idea the ocean penetrated so far inland. The interface between the ocean and the river has several influences on the main stem. First, there are 2 high tides and 2 low tides each day. In some upstream areas, these tides can be as much as 4 feet between high and low tide. Ocean fish can also move far upriver, mingling with freshwater species, creating an incredibly diverse ecosystem associated with brackish water. Finally, as the water from the ocean flushes upriver during high tides, it can slow the downstream force of fresh water. It is such an amazing interface system. In addition, there is what is called a salt line, which is way up the river as well. Again, just such an amazing system. While the estuary we see today is a fascinating ecological system, it is only one part of the Hudson River. There is another part of the river that is equally fascinating. During the Ice Ages, the ocean level in this region was much reduced. Therefore, the glacial river carved its way along the exposed land to the lower ocean level. As the oceans rose following the melting of the glaciers, this lower portion of the river was drowned by the ocean. While the glacial river channel is drowned by the current ocean, it is still a distinctive feature on the landscape. This is also one reason why the Hudson River of today is so deep. It is a story of 2 rivers, one of a glacial river and one of a post-glacial river. One of the more distinctive geological features of the lower Hudson River is the Palisades that lie on the New Jersey side of the river and are easily visible for miles. This distinctive feature was created by magma surging into a seam in the overlying sandstone, creating the distinctive Palisade features. As the surrounding sandstone eroded, over time, the intruded magma was exposed. The Palisades area was, and is, a highly valued resource in the development of New York and the surrounding region. These values were diverse and sometimes came into conflict. At the end of the 19th century, the Palisades were being mined for railroad ballast. However, there is also an appreciation of the scenic value of this resource. It was impossible to reconcile the beauty of the land while at the same time blowing it up for other uses. This led to a pioneering effort to protect the region. In 1899, the New Jersey Federation of Women's Clubs fought for the establishment of the Palisades Interstate Park Commission, which began the work of acquiring the region for recreational and scenic preservation. Good job, ladies. Nicely done. While there is one larger Hudson River sub-watershed, looking at a watershed this large and diverse as a single system can be challenging. So let's break it down into three smaller sub-watersheds. In the northwest, we have the Mohawk River sub-watershed that feeds into the lower Hudson River. Above the junction where the Mohawk joins the Hudson, we have the upper River Hudson watershed. And below this junction, as expected, we have the lower Hudson River watershed, or the Hudson River estuary. Let's look at these watersheds individually to see how they come together to build the larger Hudson River watershed. We will start with the Mohawk River watershed, which starts here. This is a larger image of the Mohawk River watershed. In this image, you can see the larger watershed, but it is also broken down to smaller sub-watersheds. We are going to work our way through each of these watersheds individually, so hang on. I'm just kidding. We are not going to do that. While each small sub-watershed is interesting and unique, I know that I would quickly lose you, and you would click onto a cat video. So we will stay at the higher level watersheds. The Mohawk River watershed encompasses around 3,460 square miles, with more than 600,000 people living within the sub-basin. In addition, this sub-watershed is one of the endpoints of the Erie Canal, which we will discuss in a later video, so stay tuned. The Mohawk watershed is characterized by rolling hills with lots of rivers, streams, and lakes. This abundance of navigable water bodies made this an important region in the early development of the United States. The close connection between the eastern U.S. and the Great Lakes region was an important draw for traders. The region is currently dominated by forests that cover about 50% of the area, largely in the upper part of the watershed. Most of the remaining area is farmland at 25% of the area, with some cities and rural residential regions found in the lower part of the watershed. The Mohawk River watershed is particularly subject to flooding, which comes in two forms. There is flooding in the winter and early spring that is related to the ice breakup on rivers, which leads to water backing up behind ice dams and other obstructions. In the late summer, flooding is related to rainfall events, often tied to hurricanes. One of the significant challenges with the flooding in this region is the amount of development located within the floodplain. These areas were built before the development of ordinances and other land use controls designed to prevent building in these areas. So unfortunately, the history of development has left many residential areas exposed to the hazards of flooding. While the short overland connection between the Mohawk and the Great Lakes region was an important connection for trade, once the Erie Canal was built, the Mohawk Basin saw rapid growth and development. Industry grew quickly because of the connection between the Great Lakes and New York City. This industrial development resulted in water quality degradation from concentrated pollution sources. Agricultural and residential development also increased as people quickly followed the new opportunities. This residential and agricultural development also resulted in an increase in pollution, but this pollution was more distributed across the landscape. In the Mohawk River watershed, there are many potential sources of pollution. These sources are classified into two kinds. One kind is called point sources that can be traced back to one specific location. For example, some potential areas of pollution are the wastewater treatment plants. while these plants treat wastewater, there are still low-level discharges that can add pollutants to the watershed. In addition, many of the urban areas have concentrated stormwater outfalls, where rainwater is concentrated into a single pipe, which can then discharge to a river. Finally, there are some abandoned areas and other hotspots known as Superfund sites that can be direct contributors to pollutant sources. In contrast to pollution that comes from specific point sources, there are many areas within the watershed that potentially contribute pollution in a more distributed fashion. For example, when rain falls over a city, much of this water will flow over the land, and it can be very hard to trace this to any particular pollutant to a specific parcel of land. The same happens in agricultural areas that are scattered throughout the watershed. This map of the rivers and streams in the Mohawk watershed shows those bodies of water that were impaired as of 2010. This data is a bit out of date, but it shows the extent of the watershed that is not meeting its desired and assigned use. At this time, about 1/3 of the rivers or stream miles were classified as either not supporting the desired use or having minor impairments. Of these, 7% of the streams were identified as impaired, which means they are not meeting their desired uses at all. About 20% of the lakes in the watershed are also classified as being threatened, minor impaired, or impaired. In order to protect and improve this portion of the larger Mohawk River watershed, the state has developed a watershed management plan. Within the plan, the larger action items include working with landowners to engage in activities to reduce pollution sources, working with cities to manage stormwater, and increasing partnerships to spread the burden of protecting the overall watershed. So while there are some challenges, both from past FEMA activities and current practices, there is a great effort underway to make sure the Mohawk River is enjoyable to those living within the watershed and to reduce the impact to the larger Hudson River watershed. Moving east, we will now explore the upper Hudson River watershed. This watershed joins with the Mohawk and then connects with the estuary portion of the lower Hudson River. So as with the Mohawk, we are going to be looking at the portion of the Hudson River that is dominated by downstream flow and not influenced by the ocean estuary or tidal flows. As with the Mohawk River, the upper Hudson River watershed is broken down into a series of smaller sub-watersheds, each with their own unique characteristics. We can go even further and break the watershed down into even smaller sub-watersheds. While I avoided looking at the individual sub-watersheds, we are going to spend time hitting the highlights from these. Really, we are. Hang on. Okay, no. I am kidding. We're going to stay at the higher watershed level. But just keep this in mind. As we are learning about the world's great rivers and lakes, we can break our larger watersheds down to ever smaller components and analyze those components to see how each smaller level influences larger watershed. This kind of analysis can get very complicated very fast, which can make it difficult to understand the entire system. But if we are going to effectively manage these systems, we do need to have an understanding of how the watershed works at different scales. The upper Hudson River, while being an area of intensive human land use for thousands of years, remains a fairly pristine region. The predominant land use and land cover of the region is forest, with about 70% of the landscape covered in several different forest types. 17% of the watershed is in agricultural production, with 7% being in row crop and 10% in pasture. Another 5% of the watershed is in residential and industrial development. 5% of the watershed is associated with wetlands, open woodlands, and open water. If you were doing math as I ran through these numbers, you will find there are some small percentage errors in my numbers. There are some small areas that are less than 1% of the watershed. And here's an interesting trivia point. 0.7% of the watershed is in golf course use. While the percentage is small, I found this to be a surprisingly large number for one specific use. People in this area must really like their golf. While there is residential development throughout the watershed, much of the population is concentrated between two of the counties within the watershed, with major population centers being around Troy, Saratoga Springs, and Glen Falls. I do love me some good Troy pizza. Within the upper Hudson River watershed, there are 6 primary threats. These include stormwater that provides excessive runoff for both developed and undeveloped land and can carry suspended and dissolved pollutants. There is agriculture that can contribute nutrients and sediments to downstream waters. Erosion can come from a variety of land uses and results in downstream sedimentation. Invasive species that are introduced, intentionally or accidentally, disrupt the larger ecological system. Wastewater, both large community systems and individual septic systems, contribute nutrients and potentially E. coli. And finally, there are dams and other drainage systems that create disconnections between segments of streams and rivers that can disrupt fish migration. Over 80% of the water bodies within the sub-watershed support their desired uses. However, there are some significant pollutants that are leading to impairments of many river and stream segments and lakes. Acid rain and mercury come into the basin from aerial sources outside of the basin and are contributing to many impairments. Within the basin, there is a legacy of industrial pollution, as well as historic development and aging infrastructure that was installed during a period when environmental conservation was not a large priority for planners and developers. As with the Mohawk sub-watershed, there is extensive planning within the upper Hudson River looking to the future, with challenges and potential solutions identified that will address many of the pollutant sources and restore the water quality within the basin. We have just finished looking at the 2 sub-watersheds that make up the upper portion of the Hudson River. These are watersheds that are free of the tidal flows from the Atlantic Ocean. Now it's time to start looking downstream into the Hudson River estuary, where the watershed becomes remarkably complex. One of the reasons I am so fascinated by the region is that I grew up not far from the river. As we were visiting relatives or traveling within the region, my family and I regularly traveled along or across the Hudson River estuary. It is only recently that I've become interested in the watershed as a system. The amazing things one learns as one gets older. As we move into the Hudson River estuary region, we are entering an even more complex and diverse landscape that has undergone centuries and millennia of human influences. This region has a rich farming history with many crop and animal farms still scattered throughout the landscape. There are also significant forest regions with large expanses of fairly undisturbed forests. This area also has centuries of human occupation from Native American communities and towns that were flourishing prior to European arrival, followed by trader towns, and now vast stretches of urban and suburban development with significant areas of industrial and commercial property. One of the key features of the Hudson River estuary system is the twice-a-day tide. Each and every day, the ocean waters flow into the river and then flow out of the basin twice. This tide raises the level of the water, inundating banks before flowing out, leaving shore areas exposed. There is also the mixing of ocean water and the upstream freshwater, creating a brackish water environment. With the regular infusion of water from the ocean, the estuary has long been a rich habitat for a variety of fish. These include saltwater fish, freshwater fish, and those fish who move from one water type to another during different phases of their lives. New York State has identified 3 large areas of resource concerns in relation to the Hudson River estuary. These are threats to water quality, threats to the habitat and ecology of the region, and challenges related to the port and maritime transportation of the area. In relation to water quality, dissolved oxygen, pathogens, nutrients, climate change, and floatable debris are the primary concerns. There are also several contaminants that are potentially leading to impaired water quality that are being monitored to understand more of how they are influencing the watershed and what, if anything, can be done to mitigate the damages. While there are many concerns around issues related to water quality, for most of the concerns there appears to be an improving trend. Overall, as people are learning more about the estuary and taking more active steps to limit additional pollutant sources and to mitigate existing and historic challenges, the water quality appears to be getting better. The state has identified 5 areas related to habitat and ecological concerns. These are generally related to proximity to the estuary and the larger influence on the estuary condition. Marine habitat is that which lies within the river corridor. Riparian and shoreline habitats are those areas that lie directly adjacent to the river. Terrestrial habitats are the upland areas, which cover most of the watershed and provide the vast area of habitat. There are also wetland areas that provide special habitat types. So how are these features trending? I'm glad you asked. Here this story is not quite as good. There are a lot of areas in which we lack enough data to make long-term trend predictions. However, for many areas, the short-term trend lines are not the best. We are seeing losses in many areas. Unlike working to improve or maintain water quality, habitat and ecological condition work is difficult because the causes of degradation are so diverse and difficult to manage at scale. However, efforts are underway, and as people continue to learn more about how their actions and behaviors influence the habitat and ecology of the region in which they live, we should see some changes in trend lines, and hopefully improvements. The harbor and marine area of the estuary is one in which there were some really bad things happening in the past. When people knew less about the products they were producing or the impact of pollution, waste was commonly dumped into the estuary where it disappeared. And when your pollution disappears, it is out of mind. However, many of these pollutants did not actually disappear. Rather, they sank to the bottom of the estuary where they accumulated. But there is some really good news related to the contamination of the port and harbor areas. For most of these really dangerous pollutants, we are seeing long-term improvements in their loadings. Not only are we seeing less being contributed to the port environment, we are seeing a reduction in what was contributed in the past. As these pollutants are reduced, animal species such as fish and oysters are taking in less, which means their flesh is healthier, and healthier for human consumption. And who doesn't like a good oyster on the half shell every now and then? The Hudson River is an area in which we can see the many people who live within the watershed taking more action in protecting and improving their watershed. Scientists, both government and citizen, are learning more about the watershed and developing a better understanding for how past actions have influenced the watershed and how future actions can improve conditions. As these scientists have worked with individuals, businesses, and local communities, people have come to care more about the river. This caring about the precious Hudson River resource has led to behavior change, which has resulted in real and meaningful changes for the better. The Hudson River is a great example of how people can take a system that was severely impacted by human actions and behaviors, implement protection activities, and drive towards a future with cleaner water and a real love of the local watershed system. This picture of a man fishing on the banks of the Hudson is an image that captures the role of the river through time. The Hudson River was an abundant resource for Native Americans who lived off the rich fishery. This rich fishery attracted Europeans who also saw the river as a transportation corridor into the upper reaches of the colonial region and the larger region around the Great Lakes. This transportation network facilitated the growth of industry and urban development, which had significant negative outcomes for the fishery of the river. As we learned more about the outcomes of our behavior, we realized we were not only changing the river, but we were changing ourselves. This care and concern resulted in local communities coming together to value and protect the river. And now, we have people once again fishing the river. At the moment, this man is fishing with his dog, but I bet in a few years, he will be teaching his child how to fish from the same spot. As this knowledge is passed down through generations, the Hudson River watershed will continue to occupy a rich spot in the saga of the world's great rivers and lakes.